All right, we can get started.
Okay, moving my little Zoomy chatty thing. Okay, hello to everybody joining us on History Matters, and so does coffee. Welcome. It is, I know, for many of us here who are teachers in one way or another, at the end of the semester, getting there in the next week or two, which is a very particularly, I guess, trying and somewhat exhausting time. I added somewhat in there to be diplomatic about it, but actually it's just exhausting. So I'm particularly appreciative of those of you who are here at this time of year. And as Matt said a little earlier, for those of you who are not here yet, we'll have fun, but this might not be our best work because I think he and I are both really tired, and yet we're here. We're here for the History Matters crowd. So really quickly, before I turn things over, as I suggested on Twitter and as went up on the website, we're going to be talking about, and we've talked about democracy before, but what I wanted to talk about this time was democracy and the founders. And I'm going to problematize the founders a little, and I'm going to problematize democracy a little. But before I plunge into that, I turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Let's try that again. Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 7,322.
What it feels like.
whatever week it is. I think it's 34 technically is what it comes out to be.
Okay.
If you don't count last week's.
I count last week.
But we count last week's. We were around and we made it work. So welcome. And before I turn it over to Joanne, just want to thank everybody for being here. And the rules of the game are as follows. Please use the chat to make sure to communicate throughout the conversation today. And please make sure that you whatever you put into the chat is germane to the conversation. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A section. That is where we will take questions. It gets a little hairy trying to jump between chat and Q&A, and it's just easier if everybody puts it in Q&A. So please use Q&A. And my weekly threat is alive and well, which is if you don't ask questions, Joanne is going to be stuck with my questions, and Lord knows my questions are not as fun as your questions. So, and as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please make sure you visit our website at www.ncheteach.org and join in all the fun. A couple webinars that are coming up. The promo real quick. The first one, of course, is we're partnering with Read, Inquire, Write out of the University of Michigan for a really fascinating exploration into some of their work and how teachers might be able to use it in their classrooms. It should be really, really exciting. And then, of course, on December 17th at 7 p.m., we're going to be joined by Pete Souza, who is the former White House photographer for Presidents Reagan and Obama. And he's going to be talking about his work, primary sources, photographs as primary sources, and the nature of leadership. So we're really looking forward to that. It's going to be an amazing event. It's going to be moderated by Leanne Potter from the Library of Congress. So please make sure that you register. Space is limited, and we are starting to fill up. So get over to the to our webinars page. Sign up, please, 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 please. With that, I turn it over to Joanne. First, we should probably acknowledge that Grace is here.
I just creepily popped up. But I just wanted to echo Joanne's. I know it's the end of the semester for many of you, either professors you're finishing up or teachers you still have quite a while ahead of you. And we meet with our tag teachers, and we're hearing that you're having a wild semester out there, all of you educators. So we just wanted to say, please take care and thank you for the work you're doing. And we're excited you can be here with us with Joanne today.
Hi, Grace.
All right, everybody. So Joanne, we'll turn it over to you, and we'll look forward to hearing about our conversation today.
Okay. And yes, indeed, newbie weighed in there.
As always.
As always. Okay. So today, as I said, we're going to be talking about democracy and the founders. And partly because I want to talk about democracy and the fact that we assume a lot of things about what democracy means, partly because I want to talk about what we do when we go back to the founding and assume what we assume about the founders. And Matt, I'm thus far, I'm like really teeny. I can't quite, I see lots of NCHE staff all over my screen right now for some bizarre reason. Anyway, so to begin our discussion of democracy, let's begin with the basics, which is the definition, right? As a historian, whenever you're writing about anything that is, you know, a principle based on a word, the first thing you obviously do is look up how it's defined, and particularly how it's defined at the time. Now, there are a couple different basic definitions of democracy. That the most simplest of all is government by the people, which is again, okay, fix it up. There we go. Let me move this out of the way too. Sorry, guys, technical difficulties. There we go. That's the most basic definition. A more detailed definition would be, and this is a quote, a system of government by the whole population of all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. And that last part is key. And those of you who have seen my American Revolution course online, which is out there in the world and is free, actually, if you're interested in it, the first lecture is something like the top 10 lessons for studying the American Revolution or something like that. And one of those lessons is think about words in the way that they were meant at the time and not the way you assume that they're meant today. And democracy is one of the key words that I talk about that with. I tell my students that when they're writing papers for any of my sort of founding era classes, that they should not use what I call democracy-speak. And by democracy-speak, I mean liberty, freedom, democracy, you know, sort of throw a lot of words out there and somehow or other it adds up to America, but no one ever talks about what those things mean. And democracy in particular really meant different things then than it means now. And this is part of what I wanted to talk about today, meant different things to different people, or they referred to it in different ways. And even just, you know, we have a Hamilton document and a Jefferson document today. And even just those two people alone in those two documents alone, you can see some pretty different assumptions, not only about whether it's good or bad, which certainly those differences are there, and Newbie has always a lot to say about democracy. Thank you, Newbie. He really does. When I talk about democracy, it typically gets him going. I think he's weighing in with bird rights. At any rate, that founders themselves, individuals, had different ideas about democracy, good and bad, and definitions of it and ways in which they approached it. So it's meanings and repercussions, part of what I want to talk about. The other thing I'm sort of implying by what we're doing this morning is we tend to think about the founders, right? The founders thought this, or the founders thought that. There is no block of founders or block O founders with a hyphen. There's no single founder view on almost anything. And we tend to, and particularly I think if you're in the realm of politics, people tend to do that. Well, the founders thought, no. And democracy is one way, even just the Constitution is one way of understanding that there was never a block of opinion. But I want to get at democracy particularly today. Now, first of all, and I suppose the most obvious thing to talk about when you're talking about the founding and democracy is if you're judging it by our standards, then you would say, no, of course the founding isn't a democracy because of all of the people there who are not taking part in the process, right? Who don't have the right to vote, who aren't considered citizens, who are treated as property, right? I mean, there's so many ways in which the founding by our standards is not democratic, that in and of itself should set alarm bells off for how we talk about and discuss it in this time period. Now, at the time, you know, when you think about the fact that the American Republic was created in a world that was pretty much monarchies, then what was going on here looked more small d democratic than what was going on in the rest of the world. So at the time, certainly people could assume and did assume that whatever was happening here was democratic in some sense of the word. But I picked Hamilton and Jefferson because you can really get a sense of the different views of democracy, and also some kind of surprising, maybe not in Hamilton's case, but some surprising views, strong views about what they thought. And I'll start with Hamilton. In a sense, only nowadays would Hamilton's views about democracy be surprising because of the musical, that he is now a good guy to everybody. And, you know, he's the guy who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and liked immigrants. And that's not quite really Hamilton. And a great example of seeing that has to do with the quote I'm going to get to of Hamilton's. The Federalists, generally speaking, so his party, his side of the political divide, were not thrilled with democracy as they understood it and as they defined it. And they defined it really as the masses making demands and putting themselves out in a way that challenged authority, right? So part of what's being discussed, particularly in the 1790s, part of the big controversy is how much power do the people have above and beyond voting? Should they be protesting, or should elections really be enough? You know, what is the working of democracy? So the Federalists respond to that by saying, I don't know precisely what it is, but that looks kind of dangerous. It's too much, right? And we saw what happened when a populace gets roused with the revolution, right? You overturn. Newby is in the middle of his cage, levitating himself with his wings, and I don't know why. It's really hard to focus. At any rate, the Federalists believed that the masses, when riled up, were dangerous. Hamilton is one of the many. There is a phrase attributed to Hamilton in which he supposedly called the people a great beast. I will say that was not probably, he's not probably the person who said that. There's no evidence that he did. And I think it's like someone said that they heard Hamilton say that. So that's kind of probably not what he said or meant. That said, he did have really strong feelings about democracy. I want to quote someone before we get to the quote that I posted. And those of you who are ever in teaching mode looking for someone who says things in a pithy, quirky, quotable way about federalism, high federalism, Fisher Ames is that guy, right? I think I mentioned Fisher Ames before as he made people cry during some of his oratory in Congress. So he was like, I guess, a moving speaker, but he wrote a lot of essays. He did a lot of writing about politics in this period. And some of his quotes are really pithy. And I just want to read you two of them that show just the environment where Hamilton makes the quote that I posted on the website. So Ames wrote that due subordination without which no society, and subordination in and of itself should like alarm, that due subordination without which no society, whether monarchical or republican, can or ever did exist, was shaken and nearly overthrown by the Jeffersonian ascendancy, right? So Jefferson rising to power, he says this not that long after Jefferson's election, subordination, the due subordination which all societies need, has been disrupted by Jefferson. He also says, after the Federalists lose the election of 1800, we, meaning the Federalists, we have thought that virtue, with so many bright rewards, had some solid power, and that with 10,000 charms, she could always command 100,000 votes. Alas, these illusions are as thin as the gloss on other bubbles, right? So he's saying, we thought that it would be apparent Federalists are virtuous and everyone would vote for us. And he says, well, that election showed that that's not true either. So the election of 1800 got a lot of Federalists very nervous about what was going on, about what this suggested about what people assumed about the government, about what this suggested about even just the balance of power in the government between South and North. Because of that, you get in 1803 and 1804, some Federalists in the North who begin at least talking with each other about seceding from the Union and forming their own confederacy, that they don't want to be threatened by Jefferson and the crazy Southern Democrats. They might want to do something different. So 1804, and so that's the year that Hamilton dies. And this is one of his last letters, actually. He wanted to write a longer letter. And he says that in the letter that I've posted there for you. And I just want to quote the 2 or 3 sentences that stand out most. He says, "I will here express but one sentiment, which is that dismemberment of our empire," and I love the use of empire there, "dismemberment of our empire will be a clear sacrifice of great positive advantages without any counterbalancing good, administering no relief to our real disease, which is democracy, the poison of which, by a subdivision, will only be the more concentred in each part and consequently the more virulent." So the real disease, democracy, right? What does he mean by that? Well, he means a version of what I said before, right? The public having an exalted, good 18th century word, overweening sense of its importance in politics, being very willing to step forward and act and protest and do things that to Hamilton and many Federalists felt disruptive and dangerous to authority and order. So when he says the real disease is democracy, he's not saying I want a monarchy, but he is saying that popular power in the way that it appears to be being expressed and the way in which Jefferson seems to have endorsed it is dangerous. But now that's Hamilton. And he's talking about kind of democracy on a ground level, right? He's talking about ideas that the Americans get about democracy, but also how that's acting out on the ground in a way that's threatening. Republicans, on the other hand, Republicans, generally speaking, are obviously speak a lot more, yeoman farmers, protest, more comfortable with protests, that they had come from a very different place than the Federalists. They're more comfortable with popular politicking. They're more, I guess, by our standards, small d democratic, except, of course, however democratic they are, certainly it's not every man, every woman, every white person, their democratic is still, by our standards, not very democratic. I think I mentioned this in a previous week, the interesting fact that Federalists tended to be more liberal about women and politics because they trusted in the order of things, the hierarchical order of things, to keep women in line to a certain degree, so you could allow them a certain amount of freedom by their logic, whereas the Republicans tended to be a little more nervous about allowing women and others to have a little bit of power, because in their mind there was a lot more ground for them to act and, in their mind, make trouble. But still, the Republican message is more small d democratic. For its time, it's radical. It's radical in part, you can tell, by the Federalist response to it. But this is what I wanted to quote from Jefferson. And interestingly, this is from his last year of life, right? So this is the year he dies too. I didn't set out to quote 2 letters from their last years. What I actually did when I thought of this topic, I was like, oh, I'll go for the Hamilton disease democracy letter. And then there's the booted and spurred letter. And I went on Founders Online and I searched disease democracy and booted spurred to be sure that I called up the right document. And of course, reminded myself that, yeah, they both died that year. So this is the little bit of Jefferson's letter that I wanted to quote. Our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all. The signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Now that's a very Jeffersonian statement, right? Jefferson, the sort of poet of democracy. He also writes this in a letter in which he's saying, I'm sorry, I can't come to your July 4th celebration, but here I shall say moving things that you can then read aloud on my behalf. So he's writing with an audience in mind, but still he's speaking in a really from a very top down sort of ethereal level about democracy as a spirit of the age that's been unleashed, that America has, in his mind, unleashed, and that will spread around the world. and that it has to do in a very generic way with the rights of man. So he's talking about democracy in a really different way than Hamilton was. Obviously, they have different views, even if they were speaking in the same way. But even here in these two statements, you can see the different levels and different ways and different rhetoric that people are deploying about this thing that we, at least in the past, took for granted, right? Democracy, what it is, what it means. That somehow it means in a general way, kind of where I started, right? Government by the people, self-government. That is what democracy is. Well, we're in a moment where, I guess I'll say for better and worse, everyone, the United States, and I think many other parts of the world as well, are really having to grapple with what democracy is, what it means, what it gets you, what vulnerabilities it leaves behind, and really, what does democracy mean? And I've talked before about how I think there are a lot of isms. You can add an ocracy to it too. There are a lot of words that people are throwing around right now in the media and everywhere else. You know, socialism, fascism, communism, democracy, authoritarianism, all of these things, assuming a lot about meanings and often assuming incorrectly a lot about meanings, that they're being used as sort of tag words that carry baggage with them rather than as words with a real meaning. And democracy is one of those words that sometimes is being used that way. And I think that's not only is democracy in some ways in danger around the world, and not only has it been in danger here in the United States, but the basic understanding of what it is has been threatened as well. You know, a lot of what what got me on Twitter in the first place was trying to talk about basic things like checks and balances and branches of government, and more recently, democracy and what it is and what it gets you, what it means. What does self-rule mean? When democracy goes away, so does your power, so does self-rule, right? I don't think people think about that. I don't think people think about the fact that voting, the right to vote, your right to vote as a citizen is bound up with democracy, and that when democracy goes away, self-rule and your right to vote and have a voice goes away. I'm yelling all the time on Twitter about accountability, right? Another fundamental aspect of democracy as we understand it today is that the people we put in office with our votes, our voice, our preferences, they are accountable to us. We put them there, we can take them out as American citizens. And that accountability, which to some degree we've lost track of, accountability is central to the working of democracy, as is a free press. Because how do we hold people in power accountable? Through the press, right? Through people who can observe what's going on and report back to us. And yes, since there has been a press, there have been better outlets of the press and worse outlets of the press, and people who are writing for party purposes and people who are trying to be more realistic in one way or another. It's not that we're suddenly in an age when the press is worse than it used to be. It's louder, it spreads faster, but you go all the way back in time and, you know, you can get Jefferson ranting as when he's president about, you know, I don't like reading them, I don't like looking at them, these damn newspapers, I understand why they have to be there, but they're full of lies, right? He hates the press. He doesn't say to suppress it, but he hates the press. But the press, that's part of its central importance, is a tool of accountability. He early on, when people are talking about the government moving to Washington from Philadelphia, one of the things that they worry about and that they say is, you know, unless we really get an active press going in Washington or even in Philadelphia, who can see what's going on, who can see what's happening in the House and Senate, who can watch it and report to the public, we will have the most corrupt government in existence, because there will be no accountability. They can do whatever they want behind closed doors or with the distance of miles in Washington. That accountability and the press are key. So all of those things are bound up with, by modern standards, what democracy is. And we really are, it's interesting when you look at some of the public debate going on right now, you have some people who are speaking as though well, that was close, but we're done. And then other people really staying more on the level of democracy is under threat. I'm in the second camp. I don't think we're done with anything. I think the election has been decided. We elected a president-elect, but I think we are living in an age when democracy is going to continually be attacked and defined and redefined. I think part of what this last few years has done for us as Americans, and I think I've said this before here on History Matters, has reminded or even taught us that democracy does not go of itself, that it needs to be defended, that it needs to be protected, that we as citizens need to defend and protect it and act in that spirit and assert our rights and protect our rights. And I think many people assume that democracy, well, we are a democracy, we're great, we're the United States, and it's great and all is good. And I think the last few years have taught us that you cannot take things for granted ever, nor should you. And if that's a lesson that we take out of the current moment, that democracy is more fragile than we thought it was, and that it requires more work to protect it, that's a good lesson. I can cheer that lesson. That's an important lesson. And again, I think in a sense, that gets us back to where we started when I said the founders didn't have one set view of democracy. In a way, neither have we, right? We've been assuming it's one thing and that it's safe and everything else. And now all of a sudden, I think many people have a different, if they have an understanding of democracy. So I'm still going to rant as a teacher and a public intellectual that many people don't have a sound sense of democracy, but still, some people do, and they have a better sense of what it is now than they did before. And that's important. So, you know, on the one hand, we can't harken back to the founders, pretend that there was one founding view about this and point to it and say yes, because the past in that way, and particularly the founding period, doesn't translate that way, nor is there one individual view of anything. And on the other hand, the second half of that equation is we need to think about definitions now. We need to think about, you know, right now what we understand it is and what we need it and want it to be and how we should protect that. The system that the founders put in motion, so the process, and I know I've talked about that before, a lot of what the founding was about was putting processes of government in motion so that if things went astray politically or any other way, that you could always go back to those processes to set things right. And that's a view that you see expressed again and again and again by some of the framers themselves, right? That if things go wrong, well, there's a process, we put it in motion. That's why Madison's very careful notes of the Federal Convention about everything that happened there, he was partly recording the process of creating the Constitution, because that too would be important in addition to the processes created by the Constitution itself. I've spoken, I know, a lot over the course of the last few years about the process being important to protect for this reason, right? That once you leave behind how the process works, once you sort of throw that away, you're kind of left foundering. And norms are one thing, and they're bound up with processes, but they're not necessarily identical. And that's dangerous too, because norms can shape processes. We've learned that lesson really well too over the last few years, more than I think even I understood before. If you'd asked me intellectually about norms, you know, I would have said, well, of course, they're vital and blah, blah, blah. And the government is a skeletal infrastructure of a government, and it was going to be fleshed in by norms. But I think we all have in our guts a different understanding of what it means when norms are violated, and that can have a profound, profound meaning on just the basic working of politics. So for all of these reasons, I raise this because we shouldn't use the founding as a shortcut to get to what we need to be thinking about and understanding and protecting today. The founders put a process in motion that they hoped would continue to operate, and we should be protecting that system and revising it as it needs to be revised. You know, the reason they put an amendment process in was that they didn't assume that whatever they did was going to stay exactly the same forever. But we need to be active citizens in this democracy. And I will never stop harping about that, but particularly now, as we're thinking about transitions and looking at the ways in which people are grappling with them, democracy should be front and center. And once electoral matters settle down and we move into other kinds of changes and other kinds of stability that we need to put in order, we then, I think, need to think again, and perhaps we could talk about this a little bit down the road. How do we communicate an understanding of what democracy is to Americans? The basics, not a partisan view, but just a fundamental view of the working of democracy and what it means to citizens, what it should mean to citizens, and perhaps what it does mean now, which is not necessarily the same thing. But still, the idea that there is an idea of democracy that we can strive towards, that we might not have achieved yet as far as equality and rights between everyone, but that the ideal and the idea of democracy as we understand it and are increasingly understanding it today, even if we have not absolutely met it, the fact that the ideal is there matters, and we have to understand what it is, and we have to vow to each other to work towards it and to protect what we have. Okay, I spoke a little longer than I should have. I got wound up. I'm gonna stop there. Grace has reappeared. So I actually, before I stop, because I always do this, so this is like, you know, as Matt said, week 582, and I still always forget the mug. I will show the mug, and when Matt reappears, he will show his background. Oops, I wore lipstick today. Okay. So I was trying to find the democracy mug, and the best that I could get was the pomp and crest mug, right? Women as the doorkeeper of Congress, because that's democracy, which didn't exist at the time. But plus it allows me to thank, remind me, who is it who gave us, Matt and I, the pomp and crest mug? Let me open my chat again. I forget everything all the time when it comes to names, but you will reappear and tell me who gave us these wonderful mugs. But that's a democracy mug. It's as close as I could come. And now I will stop talking, and Grace wants to chime in.
Well, since I was already in the room, Matt said I could do questions today.
Oh, excellent. So, okay.
Very, very nice of him. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. That was wonderful. That's things we've really been thinking about, all of these issues at NCHE, and I'm delighted that you're speaking to them and speaking to them with educators. So just a reminder, please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. We do have some here that I'm going to get into. All right, so we have a question from Tom. Was the discussion of the word democracy in the founding period shaped or influenced by how that form of government had been practiced in ancient Athens? For example, due subjugation having been achieved by limiting the franchise to free men and excluding women, slaves, non-citizens, and perhaps other categories of people?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, that whole generation, particularly that, you know, those political elite, I'm going to change my view here. There we go. That political elite was very, very, very well versed in the classics, in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. They, as thinkers in the Enlightenment, they understood history as a big grab bag of facts and laws and rules and standards. And so when they were thinking about devising the government for the United States, they didn't think like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to look at ancient Greece and ancient Rome? They thought, well, let us look at the universal rules of government over all time. And Greece and Rome were, you know, obviously, and particularly Greece and Athens were places where they looked. Now, when they looked back to Athens, what they saw was instability, right? So to them, I think that when they talk about democracy in ancient Athens, they're not speaking about anything glorious. They're thinking about something that's unstable. I mean, even, I didn't quote earlier Jefferson, but even Jefferson at an earlier point is uneasy with what democracy means in that kind of standard. So I could have even said that before we opened it to questions. Even that they themselves didn't consistently think the same thing about democracy over the course of their lives. So they did think back, but in the case of Athens, I think part of that lesson was it's unstable. The people can be swayed. You know, look at what demagogues can do. I think it taught lessons, but it taught lessons that in their mind alerted people to dangers.
Interesting. So Athens is actually sort of kind of dangerous. So
It certainly revealed, bad things that could happen in addition to other things.
right. So we may see it as not a particularly large franchise, but to them, this was getting a little wild and crazy. So interesting. Thank you. And from Clinton, weren't the founders' major concern to avoid having what they saw as the injustices of the British monarchy?
Repeat the question.
Weren't the founders, and I suppose Clinton's looking for one way that the founders were speaking as one voice. The major concern is to avoid having what they saw as the injustices of the British monarchy.
Well, so yes. I mean, what they were trying to do, and they were in constructing, actually in the Articles of Confederation, but then more so in the case of the Constitution, they were trying to figure out who gets power and how much. And yes, the immediate example they had was the monarch, was the king, who in their minds had far too much power, and they were responding against it. And you can see that, like Pennsylvania, had an extreme government in which and a lot of the state governments actually backed away from executive power initially when they were creating their state governments during and after the revolution, because they were afraid of that kind of power. So yeah, some of what Americans were doing, and particularly the founder folk, was trying to put something in motion that on the one hand would allow power to be assigned to people, and on the other hand would not allow so much power to be assigned that it would have monarchical sway. Now that said, Hamilton was someone who basically openly said, as close as we can get this to a monarchy, the better off we are, because in his mind, the weight of power and motion was with the people, and the government, and particularly the national government, which was new and weak and unproven, that you had to protect that because it had no authority behind it. So in his mind, that was what he talks a lot about, giving power to that national government, not because simply he's someone who wants a strong government, but because he really feared its authority. And when you read, for example, you can see his frustration in, I believe it's the New York ratification debates over the Constitution, when they're talking about, how much power does this have and how much power does that have, and should this have power and should that have power? And Hamilton says something like, at some point you have to assign power, right? At some point you can't distrust it. At some point someone has to have power. Monarchy and a monarch was a way of understanding power that they were uneasy with. But again, there was a spectrum of forms of uneasiness when it came to that basic thing.
Interesting. Thank you. And Carolyn wants to know, how large did the French Revolution loom in the minds of the Federalists in shaping their views on democracy?
Yeah, the French Revolution. If I could run in circles and wave my arms in the air, that would be what the Federalists the French Revolution. So on the one hand, initially, people were very encouraged by what seemed to be going on in France, because Americans did, much like Jefferson suggests in that last letter, many Americans did feel that, look what we did. We had a revolution and we created a more fair form of government, and now it's spreading around the world, and France is the first country to catch the contagion, and we are making the world a better place. And then, of course, France is a true social revolution and has all of the violence entailed with it. And it becomes something that increasingly the Federalists are really not only not comfortable with, but they are truly fearful that it's going to come to American shores. So in the late 1790s, I mean, the 1790s is a really fractious era, but the late 1790s, from 1793, really when the revolution starts to truly heat up, that's second half of it, is kind of particularly bonkers and angry, and people are throwing accusations around. And part of what they're afraid of is that what's happening in France is going to happen in the United States. That's the Federalists' real fear. And there's I think I quoted this letter at some point in the past. If I did, you will forgive me, but it's relevant to this. In later years, when John Adams is talking about this period, his presidency, with Jefferson and those sort of wonderful letters they write to each other as retired presidents, Adams talks about being in the president's house and being terrified because there were people in the streets and they were wearing cockades suggesting that they supported the French Revolution, and some of them were armed, and the servants in his house armed themselves in case they needed to protect him. And the word that he uses to describe the people in the street with guns is terrorism. he says to Jefferson, "What think you of terrorism, Mr. Jefferson? What think you of terrorism?" And that's how he describes what's going on in the streets. So that tells you, first of all, before I read that letter, I don't think I thought about how far back that word goes. But the fact that he says that ties right into this. That's the contagion of the French Revolution, terrifying Federalists. You can go through Hamilton's letters. There's some things he didn't ever publish, but they're largely rants about the fear that the revolution is going to overturn American government.
That's very interesting. I just had someone get in touch with me recently, an acquaintance who was reading about the French Revolution, and said, "Did you know how crazy the French Revolution was?" Like, yeah, it was.
Yes, but then this makes Jefferson even more radical, right? So
Yeah.
people talk to him about the revolution, and he's like, "Well, there needs to be a little bloodshed for the tree of liberty," right? I mean, that's a radical statement. Even at the time, he tended to make statements like that. I think it's Monroe maybe who says, or Madison, who says Mr. Jefferson tends to talk large. He has to throw these sparkling sentiments out, and then they're kind of radical. That this is what he was addressing at some dinner table, I'm sure.
Well, and Gloria is getting to that Mr. Jefferson and the way he speaks. She says, didn't Jefferson mean the meritorious elite when he thought about the people? And she notes he lives on a mountaintop and waxes eloquently about people he did not associate with.
Right. Well, I would say he's not just thinking about the elite, but he's also not entirely comfortable mingling with these people. I mean, a great example of this is I guess it's before the 1800 election. I think it's 1800 and not 1796. But there's a moment in there when he writes to, again, I think it's Monroe, and says something like, maybe we could arrange a spontaneous display of excitement at me when I come back to Charlottesville, right? Maybe we could, so basically get some people together and then let's have them be there being happy that I'm back. Right. So he's like, those are the people who supposedly he shouldn't be mingling with, but he understands, we need to see people loving me. And I think it's, again, I can't remember if it's Monroe or Madison. I think it's Monroe who writes back and says, he didn't put it this bluntly, but it's basically, I don't know if we can do that. Like, I don't know. I'm not sure if we can get a crowd of people to cheer for Thomas Jefferson, which in and of itself is interesting. I think he very much understood that it wasn't just the elite that were going to have power. You can see that in the 1790s in the ways that they're responding to what's going on in the streets and popular protests. It's the Federalists that want to silence people. But just as Gloria is suggesting, it's one thing to talk that way. It's one thing to talk about principles that way. It's one thing to insist that should be a reality. And it's another thing to be walking around in the street mingling with those kinds of people. So it is always important, even with the most, small d democratic of these founder folk, to recall that they're very privileged elites who can afford to speak large because they are, in one way or another, on mountaintops.
Interesting. Thank you, Gloria. Lovely literal and metaphorical image there. Judith wants to know, can you speak a little bit about Edmund Morgan's idea about the popular fiction we depend on? That even though I may not have voted for someone, is the danger right now the potential collapse of this popular fiction?
Well, I mean, I think, and it's been a while since I read that, the Morgan book. Is it We the People? I can't remember what the name of that book is. Someone will be able to tell me. It's sitting on my shelf with a white cover with red writing, and I can't remember the title, but at any rate, it's about this. I think I've talked about this in other ways, about the fact that when I was finishing my last book and I was writing about Congress and how a dysfunctional Congress makes it hard for Americans to see a we, because if Congress can't engage with others at all, how do we have a sense that there is a we? I think this is a larger question about what sense do we have of a we? I think we're in a moment, and this is not unrelated to what I said before, when there's a pretty minimal sense of a we, right? I mean, to the point that, I won't wear a mask, says somebody, because my rights, and the most obvious thing there is, yeah, you have lots of rights, but we, we need people to do something for others and not just for themselves. So we're in a moment when there's not a lot of a sense of a larger good and of society in some kind of way. How to get people back to thinking about some kind of a larger we than themselves and the people they agree with, I don't have the answer to that, but that's where we are. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, it is a fiction. It's a fiction that we probably have taken for granted in some way or another, and that slowly over the course of the last couple, I don't know how many decades, has been slowly eroding. But yeah, I think during extremely polarized moments, that's one of the things that's being questioned. I think the moment that we're in now, because it's not just polarized, but we are really talking about democracy, the we it is up for debate. And that's, I mean that on the most basic sort of ground level. The only way that, democracy can be overturned is if some of we the people decide that we the people no longer means what we thought it meant before. So it's a roundabout answer. But
And that idea of we.
Inventing the people. Thank you, Judith.
Interesting. Yeah. So Richard has a question about the education. We've seen some history education initiatives from the federal government recently that NCHE and other organizations have responded to. So I think generally, Richard, I'm going to riff on your question a little, but I think it's interesting to think about the role of the education system and educators and the extent to which we should work toward creating a we, or the role of civics education in a very divided country and promoting ideas of democracy. So I wondered if you'd just like to speak to that a little, and in the chat, educators, you as well. I think it is really interesting, the role of educators in this idea of democracy. So I'd like to open that up for a little bit of discussion, if that's all right with you, Joanne.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, well, that's it's easy to make that into a broad generalization that doesn't mean a lot, which I think would do a disservice to it, because I truly do think part of the reason for what I was suggesting during my comments about people not really understanding what democracy is, or how fragile it is, or the responsibilities of citizens to maintain it, is because I think in one way or another, our educational system sort of didn't, I don't want to say didn't take that seriously, because there used to be civics classes and I remember taking them, but I think we need to think about, and this will be an interesting thing to see people's comments about, we need to think about how we're getting across that really fundamental understanding, not in a partisan way, but in a mechanical sort of spirit of government way. What is democracy? How does it work? What rights do we surrender when we don't have it? What does that mean? Pulling it away actually from people and talking in a real fundamental way about the ideas and ideals and principles that underlie American society, even if, as I suggested earlier, even if we don't meet them. I know we're at this moment, and I think about this and talk about this a lot with my students. We're in this moment where, on the one hand, people are saying, with great reason, we've always been a racist country. We've always, we have deep roots about not meaning the ideals that we supposedly put in motion as a country. And that's true. And there's a lot of reason for that. And that's, you can't understand the United States without understanding that. The other side of that equation is the fact that the ideals were put out there, even if they were ignored or, debased, that matters too, even if they're not met. And I think, some people are like, it's all about the ideals, and you guys are making the ideals look bad by talking about all the ways in which they're not met. And then others are saying, well, no, but they're not being met. How can you make things look that good? And I think the middle space there is, yeah, they've never been met. But the fact that those ideals are there, that's a tool, that's a weapon, that's a way for people to reach for more and push for more and fight for more, right? Those ideals matter. If they're not there, there's no place to go to, there's no place to rise to. So I think education kind of needs to get across that idea. Not only of the mechanics of how the system is working, but the ideals, even though they're not met, even though they're opposed, even though the people who put them in place didn't meet them and often violated them, the fact that they're out there in the world matters. It does. And we do with them what we want, right? That's whatever the founder said, we are now the ones responsible for bringing life or not bringing life to them. But you know, I think this is going to be a big sweeping statement. I think among other things, I think loving this country means knowing that the ideals are there, appreciating the fact that they're there, and that there's something about the spirit of the country that is connected to them, and having all of the ways in which we have failed to meet them up front and center, so we are seeing the nation for what it is. I don't think you can understand who we are without both halves of that equation. All of the failures we've had, all of the ways in which where we are now is a product of what we have not done before, and the promise of what we can reach towards, which is not to be discarded just because we haven't gotten there. Yeah, I get down off of my my soapbox here, but I've been thinking about that a lot. So.
Yeah, well, as have I. It's literally my job to think about history education. And I, when we had our equity summit, Uhuru Williams referenced the Langston Hughes poem about how America has never been, but in the poem he swears that it shall be. And I think that's a lot of what we do, is acknowledging that there are both incredible ideals and deep disappointments in American history, and threading that needle is tricky as an educator. And we do have lots of. We need to
know it's there, right? We need to know the needle is there rather than pretending that it isn't.
I think that's very important. And educators, we would love to hear from you about things you need and resources to support that difficult work of both teaching the ideals and acknowledging the deep disappointments and failures of those ideals in American society. So let us know about that, and I will look at those. And just a moment, I'd like to get back to that conversation about education and the role of the educator, because it is important, and there's going to be discussion about national initiatives, both from the nonprofit angle and from the federal government. So I think we're going to continue to have those discussions. Beth does have a question here. Isn't agreement on the processes of democracy part of the agreement on the we the people, we who share the common process? And I think that's getting to what you were talking about, Joanne.
Well, right. But some of what we're talking about when we talk about processes is the Constitution, right? It's not every process is enshrined in the Constitution, but the Constitution, more than anything else, is about processes and power. But yeah, I mean, if you're talking about processes, you're talking about kind of like frustrated Hamilton, right? Ways of disseminating power and what kind of powers we have as citizens. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty fundamental is what you're talking about. You know, I mean, Hamilton was right, and it's all in one way or another, it's all about power. You know, Hamilton, in this period, different people thought about how to manage or how to handle power in different ways. Hamilton's view of humankind and government was what you need to do is assume that all people are basically self-interested and on some level bad. And what you need to do is put a system in motion that channels power, that puts people's self-interest, their selfishness to the best possible use. So he saw government as being a way to channel bad passions, right? And so it has to be strong, right? Because in Hamilton's view, yeah, we're, you know, people who somehow think we're going to be all wonderful and virtuous and think of each other, as I was suggesting before, they're nuts. Right? Like that's not how people act, right? And so we need a really strong government to do that. So it is all about power, but when you're talking about power, you're talking about self-interest. And when you're talking about self-interest, you're talking about politics. And here we are in just that moment. So.
Thank you. And we're getting some very interesting comments about, again, these ideas of democracy in the chat, and also education. We're seeing that in some states, civics is being cut. There's not much funding. So those are all things we can continue to kick around some in the after party too. I do want to ask Jennifer's question. She finds that, and I think many of us hear this, people often say, well, actually, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. And what is the proper response when people say that to you?
Okay, so a republic is a democratic form of government. You know, I mean, a democracy, you know, if a democratic government is governed by the people, a republic is democratic. So, we are a republic, we're a democratic republic. So we are a democratic government and we are a republic. I think the attempt to separate those ideas has more to do with distancing yourself from democracy. Well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. It's like, well, no, we, are we a democracy in the sense that the founders might have thought about it, meaning every single person takes part in the government and there's no representation? No. But, are we, a democratic kind of government? Yeah, we are. And republics are democratic. So I think that's a false distinction that sometimes is made for partisan purposes.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes, because I think you may have even said that on Twitter. I feel like
I might have.
Yes.
It's back
It's helpful because that is sort of a favorite comeback. I've noticed lots of people say that. So thank you. And actually, Gloria wants to know if Madison felt the same way about channeling self-interest as Hamilton.
Well, he believed, like Hamilton, that there needed to be a stronger national government to be able to I guess, channel power in a way that would, get past what the states were doing. So basically there needed to be something more powerful at the center of this new government, which is how they came together during the Federal Convention, the Constitutional Convention. I don't think he had as dire a view of humankind as Hamilton did. That doesn't mean that they didn't have some fundamental agreements on what the government needed to be, basically, and what generally dealing with people meant, with a government. But well, it's interesting. There's a letter. There's a letter written. I can't remember who it's by. It's in UVA, in the archive in UVA, in the rare book library. And it's a letter. I want to say that the guy is a tryst. At any rate, he visits Madison in Madison's old age. And says to him, and Madison's old age is like Hamilton's dead, Jefferson's dead, everybody's dead, and says to Madison, Hamilton's son is going to write a biography of his father, and he's going to say in it that you abandoned him, that you agreed on what government should be, and that then you abandoned him. And according to this letter, which describes in great detail this conversation, Madison first looked pained and said something like, he is? Like, and you could tell it's sort of painful, right? You sort of feel like, oh, poor Madison's kind of wounded by that. And then he stops and he says, I abandoned Hamilton. And he pauses and then says, Hamilton abandoned me because he tried to administration the government into being something it was never intended to be. And he uses administration, the noun, as a verb. And according to the person writing the letter, he had this little happy smile, like, look what I just did there. Like I used administration as a verb. But that he's saying what he thought, which is that they agreed. And according to Madison's logic, Hamilton, once he was in office and had power, tried to use the administration to give different kinds of power to the national government that, according to Madison, he hadn't intended should be there. So the two men themselves might not have agreed on how they did or didn't agree with each other, but that was Madison's old age take. Hamilton, when he talked about Madison, he felt betrayed. He basically thought, I was friends with Madison, Thomas Jefferson took him away, is the essence of some of Hamilton's letters, right? We agreed, and then Jefferson came back all corrupted by France and then took Madison back, and it's not fair. And he says something like, Madison is a more complicated individual than I took him to be, so Hamilton's just sort of weirdly personal about it. But I think Madison's comment is really fascinating to me about where they agree and where they didn't.
Sometimes talking about all these men's letters and the way they come across in them just makes me want to delete all my own emails, since I wonder how I'm going to come across.
True.
Well, we are at 11 o'clock. We will move into the after party here in a moment when we turn off our recording and just chat a bit, free form. But for those of you who are leaving us, I did want to thank Joanne for being with us once again with NCHE and History Matters, and so does coffee. We're thrilled that you do this with us every week. And we do have lots of great events coming up with NCHE. We have a webinar with Read, Write, Think coming up on December 8th, and we have an incredible webinar with Pete Souza, the former White House photographer, on December 17th. So please check out NCHE.
Newbie says goodbye too, clearly.
Oh, is that Newbie? I heard some sound. I assumed it was my kid.
It's Newbie saying goodbye, and thank you to everyone. As always, I thank you for being here and creating this community that we've created that meets every week, that matters, particularly given everything that we were talking about today about democracy and the we. You know, this is one of many we's, including feathered beings, that really matter. I swear that when I talk about democracy, he gets very, very agitated. Figure out the logic, but really, thank you all. Yes, history matters, and yay, Carolee, yay, history matters community. Thank you for being here. Any of you who are here who happen to be new, the after party is when we no longer record what we're doing and we have a slightly less formal conversation. So stick around. We'll just go straight into the after party at this point. Otherwise, come back, join us next week. By next week, I'll have figured out what we're talking about. We'll have another conversation.
Yes, and you can always watch recorded versions of Joanne's presentations and see all our other resources at ncheteach.org. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now. Thank you all.